Hello and welcome back to 5 Minute Geography. However, this season we're going to be focusing on the Leaving Certificate Geography paper and getting them all important H1 answers by explaining as simply as possible the world around us. So, whether you're a student gearing up for exams or a teacher looking for extra resources, you're in the right place. So, subscribe to stay updated and let's tackle this course together. So today we're going to look at isostatic movement. Now, isostatic movement refers to the uplift of the land, okay? And this uplift may be a response to either the sheer weight of rock or ice on the land, and also tectonic forces may also cause the uplift. So all landforms show a balance between tectonic processes, okay, which are endogenic forces, and surface processes, which are things called exogenic forces. This balance can be upset, and we call this change in the balance of endogenic and exogenic forces. We call this isostatic movement. Isostatic movement can be caused either by the sheer weight of ice pushing the lithosphere, so the crust, the lithosphere, into the upper rigid part of the mantle, which we call that the astenosphere. So don't forget, the lithosphere is floating on the astenosphere or the mantle. If, for example, we have ice sheets pressing down on the Earth's crust, it causes that lithosphere to be pushed down into the mantle. When the ice sheet then is removed, uplift then begins to happen. So the crust slowly begins to bounce back up from the upper rigid mantle or the astenosphere. So this is the balance between endogenic and exogenic forces that causes this isostatic movement. Now, isostatic movement can have an effect on the landscape. Isostatic movement, again, being the uplift of the land, eustatic movement being the retreat of the ocean's water. If there's an ice age, for example, think of ice caps as a sponge soaking up all the water. So retreat begins to happen, and a drop in base level or sea level begins to happen. This then is known as eustatic movement. So there are two processes that causes a change in base level there: isostatic movement and eustatic movement. The features then, which is what we want to look at in terms of geography and answering questions on this, we need to see what isostatic movement does to the Earth's crust. And we call this fluvial adjustment. We look at features like nick points, paired terraces, incised or entrenched meanders. And then if we look at the coastal features, you're looking at things like raised cliffs, raised caves, and raised beaches. In terms of fluvial adjustment, fluvial processes adjust to isostatic uplift to achieve a state of balance. So the state of balance for a river is a graded profile. So this is a smooth or concave profile between the source of the river and its base, usually as it enters the sea. Isostatic processes create landforms of adjustment. So nick points and paired terraces are examples of some of these landforms. In terms of nick points, so a nick point basically is a sharp change in the slope of the long profile of a stream, tend to be step-like features So, such as waterfalls or rapids can occur in these nick points. A fall in base level causes the river to adjust by cutting down into the bed. So a nick point tends to mark this adjustment. So because we have a change in sea level, the river gains velocity. And as it gains velocity, it begins to cut back down into the profile of the river. So vertical erosion begins to take place. As the land is uplifted, even the river is rejuvenated to be made young again. And the river then ultimate aim is to get to that base level. So in order to get to that base level, it's eroding downwards, so vertical erosion. So down cutting starts. The lower course of the river then flows on a steeper slope and has a greater velocity than you'd expect at this stage. So the river then is attempting to create a new concave profile of vertical erosion. Nick points then mark the intersection of the old and the new profile. So these nick points tell us where river rejuvenation has begun or started to take place. So these nick points represent the place where the river once entered the sea. So it used to enter the sea here. Sea level dropped, river rejuvenation began to take place again. So this vertical erosion. At nick point B here, the river entered the sea, and again there was a drop in sea level for the second time, and rejuvenation began to take place again, causing the river to gain in velocity, and therefore vertical erosion will take place. Nick points can retreat upstream as waterfalls and undercutting happens, so headward erosion can also happen. So if we're talking about on the Irish landscape, they can be found on the River Barrow in County Kilkenny, would be an example of a nick point in Ireland. You can also spot them on OS maps. Spot them on OS maps by looking at the contour lines. If the contour lines are very, very close together, well then you're talking about a steep slope or a sudden steep slope. So there you'd find your nick points. Paired terraces is the same idea again. River rejuvenation causes the vertical erosion of the old river valley. So here's our old river valleys. The river begins vertical erosion. As it does so, a new valley floor then is formed in its old floodplain. So this creates a valley basically within a valley. The downward erosion then leaves edges of the old floodplain elevated. So these things here, and these then we call terraces. So the same idea again. Vertical erosion, so the cutting down, replaces the lateral erosion. Why? Well, because we have more slope. We have more slope, then it's faster moving water, higher velocity of water, meaning more vertical erosion. Another example of a feature would be incised and entrenched meanders. So again, as a river begins to meander, lower stage, lateral erosion tends to take place. So in this case, with entrenched meanders, we have lateral and vertical erosion taking place. So basically what this is a deeper meander. Okay, so because the river begins to cut down into the old floodplain of or the floor of the river. So steep cliffs or steep sides then are formed on the outer bends of the meander. With incised meanders are also referred to. Entrenched and incised meanders is the same thing. In terms of ingrown meanders, which is just slightly different, with ingrown, it's just one side, the outer bend, is steeper than the inside bend. That's all really. That's just due to differential erosion. It could be different rock type and so on. So one rock type will be more resistant. So there we have nick points, paired terraces, and incised meanders. Those are the features that are formed when a river is subject to isostatic movement or isostatic change. In terms of coastal isostatic movement, well, it's the same idea again. When the Earth's crust is not the Earth's crust, we know, is not rigid. It sinks and it rises because it's floating on the asthenosphere. And because of the weight of the ice, it pushes the crust down. With the removal of the ice after the Ice Age, the Earth's crust begins to kind of bounce back up again. And we call this then, when we look at the coast, we call this coastal emergence. So isostatic movement also impacts the coastlines. So when the weight is added to the Earth's crust, the sea level rises relative to the land. When the weight then is removed from the crust, the land, as I said, rises from the asthenosphere. So when this occurs, sea levels fall relative to the land. So this rising and sinking is called isostatic movement, and the features of this would be things like raised beaches, raised sea cliffs, and raised platforms. So these were created by the same coastal processes active that we see today, hydraulic action, abrasion, attrition, solution, but they're formed when the sea level was much higher. So the sea level was, as you see in the diagram here to the right, sea level was much higher at the time. Sea was here, so therefore cliffs and sea stacks and sea caves were formed, beaches. As sea level then drops or land rises, well then they're left high and dry, and new beaches and new cliffs are formed. So example of that would be on the Antrim coast, or in County Donegal we have a raised beach as well. Some exam questions then. Our first one is explain how rivers adjust, that should say, to a change in base level with reference to examples that you have studied. Now explain how rivers adjust, so therefore you're just limited to discuss rivers. It says give examples, so therefore you must give Irish examples. Explain how isostatic change has impacted on the Irish landscape using examples that you have studied. Well, now you're open to discuss river rejuvenation as well as coastal isostatic movement as well. And again, it's important to give examples. And lastly, isostatic processes involve adjustments to the balance between land and sea. Discuss how these processes have shaped the Irish landscape. Well, let's take the first part first. Here they're asking you to discuss isostatic processes. So discuss how isostatic movement happens. So again, endogenic and the exogenic forces. Then once you've discussed that, now you're looking at how these processes have shaped the Irish landscape. Again, you're open to rivers. You look at nick points, incised and entrenched meanders, paired terraces, and also in terms of coastal processes, raised beaches, cliffs, raised platforms, etc. If there's a particular topic you'd like covered or something you're struggling with, feel free to get in touch in the comment section below and I'll aim to cover it in future videos. So subscribe to stay updated and let's tackle this course together.